Well, I'm joined now by the founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, Dr. Alan Mendoza. Thanks so much for joining us. What do you make of the comments that have been splashed all across the front page of the Telegraph and other newspapers this morning?
Well, Robin Simcox is right, isn't he? I mean, he's pointed out to an obvious problem, which is that every Saturday, the streets of the centre of our capital become no-go zones for British Jews, who are rightly worried about wandering into an area where they should have every right to be in as anyone else in this country, and to be faced by people carrying slogans that are sometimes anti-Semitic, sometimes have genocidal intent on them, and just a generally very hostile atmosphere. I think it's a fair comment, and he's right about it.
The polls at the beginning of these protests showed the British public believing, whether they agreed with the protests or not, that, in Britain, people have the right to protest and so on. Do you think that people's attitudes have changed as the weeks and indeed months have gone on? Because these protests, among other things, I mean, they as well as being very offensive and intimidating to large sections of this country, they also close businesses and much more. Do you think that public sentiment is turning against these protesters?
I think in one sense, I'd like to see some polling, firstly, to that question to be asked, so that people understand what's happening right now. But I think the more interesting bit is that I think for most people, if they're not in the centre of London or having some purpose, they've kind of just, sort of blocked it out. It's become part of the general noise. I think that's what James Cleverly essentially was saying when he told the protesters last week, you've made your point. Everyone knows what you're doing and nobody particularly cares anymore about it. But you're right, there is a disruption to shops. If you want to go shopping in central London, it's become, sort of a race to get through hundreds of thousands of people sometimes who are trying to stop you from doing your shopping. And Douglas, I think, we have to look at concepts of liberty here, don't we? We talk about freedoms. Yes, of course, there's a freedom to protest, and nobody would want to see that curtailed. But there's also a freedom from having your lives disrupted week in, week out. And I don't think the freedom to protest means that any time you want to do something, it should be given precedence over the freedoms of others to enjoy their time. To go back to the Robin Simcox comment, I know of synagogues who've had to, not have services at their usual times simply because they're worried about what might happen if their members walk out into a mass march. Now, that's not freedom, is it?
No, that's astonishing. I mean, you can only imagine the noise and the protests that would occur in this country if anything similar happened in regards to Muslim worshippers having to change their orders of service or their times of service or feeling under such threat. But tell me, Dr. Mendoza, last Friday, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, gave this speech on the steps of Downing Street. We were talking about it in the last hour. And it's a sort of emergency statement, rather surprising circumstances, rather surprised he gave it. And he talked about what you've just mentioned, the problems that the protests have brought, that the messages effectively hit home, but, effectively called on Britain to be more resilient towards extremism. And immediately after he gave that speech, the various groups that organise these weekly protests announced that they were going to do another one the next day, and they did. Are these people just laughing at the Prime Minister?
Well, I'm afraid they somewhat are, and I think that the core message of that speech was great. We've got to stand up against this, be resilient, stop our streets from being taken over. But he pointed out essentially to the police having to do their bit here, and I think part of the problem is that the protesters are laughing at the police as much as the Prime Minister and the rest of us, because they know that the police are somewhat cowed by their presence. And for whatever reason, the police are not willing to enforce our existing legislation that could quite easily control some of the wilder excesses at these marches, because there's just a reluctance, it seems, to do so. So I think the protesters are laughing at everyone here in this country, saying, look how weak you all are. Even when you say you're going to get tough, you're not going to get tough.
Well, let me bring you to an example of that. You mentioned the existing laws that the police are not using. The Prime Minister talked about new laws that he might bring in. What new laws are needed? I mean, we were talking also in the last hour about the burglary rates in this country. Half of burglaries in the UK don't even get anywhere near being solved. And as far as I know, burglary is already against the law. And nothing happens about that. So, I mean, what's the point of new laws and what would they even be?
Well, that's it, isn't it? If you don't enforce the law, it doesn't matter how many laws you have. You can have laws as long as your arm, and yet it won't make any difference. I think what people are desperately wanting now is to see both the existing laws enforced to the full, in the way that we would have recognised, 10, 20 years ago would have been the norm if protests continued in the way that they have been doing so. And if, for whatever reason, there is a legal problem with the current laws, then sort of with the minimal amount of fuss, insert new laws that then also get enforced. But it's the enforcement factor that matters more than just saying a new law is coming and being processed. Without the enforcement, there is no purpose in having this discussion at all.
And one final thing, whilst I've got you, I'm just very struck by the fact that what you mentioned earlier about synagogue services having to move. I've heard from many Jewish friends and others that the genuine fear that people have, and the just months of people who are Jewish in this country, for instance, not being willing to go into the centre of London with their families. Do you think that in some way this has been too quiet, this concern? In that, I'm just trying to think, if any other group of people in this country felt a fear of going into the centre of London on an average shopping day, I think there would be uproar. I think that if there were marches in the centre of town by some kind of racist organisation that wanted to kill all black people, for instance, people would be talking about it. We wouldn't have had to have waited months for a front page headline like this.
No, Douglas, you're absolutely right. It's yet another example of what David Baddiel wrote in his book, that Jews seemingly don't count. That's essentially what it is. But the problem with that is, as you well know, is that if you start saying, oh, certain sections of the population are less important than others and we're not going to listen to them, it isn't long before the protesters move on to their next target. Yes, okay, the Jews might be today's target, but tomorrow it's other people who might oppose other views that they have in common. And then we soon discover as a society that the danger of ignoring one problem when a no-go zone has been established is that it's much, much harder to bring people out to oppose the no-go zonization, as it were, for other people as well. So we should be much more attuned to the realities of what's been going on in London for the past few months. We should have been on top of it from day one. We've left it very late, but it isn't too late. That's the whole point. At any given moment, we could have the apparatus of law and order swing back in action and finally show that this is not a protesters free-for-all, and that, yes, there's a right to protest, but you can't do it if you're going to intimidate others.